Hey there, welcome to my channel. My name is Pesky, and if you're returning, it's nice to see you again. If you're new, thanks for joining us. Today I will be reading the final 3 stories in the True Ghost Stories Real Haunted Hospitals and Mental Asylums series. It's written by Zachery Knowles, and the link if you want to purchase it yourself, I'll post it below. So it's Halloween. All of the kitties will probably be out trick-or-treating. You can never be sure, but I hope that it's gone back to trick-or-treating for this year. And I will be taking my own out, one of them for the very first time. So that will be exciting, and I'm sure I'll get some enjoyment out of watching it. But on to our stories. So these are the final 3 stories from our book. And I'm hoping that they've saved the best for last with these ones, but we'll find out soon enough as we start reading. So, let's grab a cup of tea or your preferred beverage, get comfortable, and let's get reading. Our first story is Beelitz-Heilstatten. Many Germans refer to the crumbling remains of Beelitz-Heilstatten as Berlin's biggest secret hiding in plain sight. Built in 1898 in southwest Berlin near Potsdam, the expansive hospital complex has a long history, standing witness to the fighting and sorrow of both world wars. In the beginning, it was a simple sanatorium built to house struggling tuberculosis patients as they fought their losing battle with a modest 600 beds. Expansion projects allowed Beelitz-Heilstatten to grow and care for the general sick of Berlin. That was until August 3, 1914, when all the patients were evicted and the hospital was taken over by the Red Cross. World War I was breaking out, and the German Imperial Army needed every bed. The times were arduous and casualties were high. The hospital treated 12,586 patients during the war. Among them was a young man named Adolf Hitler. Then a largely unknown army corporal, Hitler came to Beelitz-Heilstatten in October 1916. He spent 2 months in the hospital recovering from a leg wound sustained during British shelling at the Battle of Somme. No one knew he would walk out of the complex, going on to do bigger and more terrible things. In 1920, the hospital was given a brief opportunity to go back to fighting the good fight, treating the general public. But soon enough, it was time for World War II, and again the hospital was commandeered for military use. That made it a target, as several bomb attacks on the hospital were testament to. With much relief, the Nazis were defeated in 1945, and Germany was divided in 2, though that meant no reprieve for Beelitz-Heilstatten. The USSR took control of the complex and turned it into a Soviet military hospital. As an important and useful structure amid the violence and uncertainties of 2 global wars, it's no surprise that Hitler wasn't the only infamous leader to grace Beelitz-Heilstatten with his presence. On October 3, 1990, Germany was reunified as one country. 2 months later, Erich Honecker, the deposed leader of the German Democratic Republic, was admitted to Beelitz-Heilstatten with liver cancer. Despite the seriousness of his illness, he only stayed for 3 months, since Germany had plans to hold him responsible for the deaths of 192 East German citizens who tried to flee the country over the Berlin Wall. Honecker ended up fleeing himself towards Moscow and away from the wrath of justice. Even as Soviet control of the country crumbled, the government wasn't in a hurry to pack up and move from Beelitz-Heilstatten. As the USSR maintained a tense grip on the hospital, a serial killer named the Beast of Beelitz, so named because most of his murders happened right by the hospital, was on the loose. Between 1989 and 1991, the Beast of Beelitz, also known as Wolfgang Schmidt, murdered 5 women and 1 baby, and attacked several others. As a former police employee, he knew how to cover his steps and stumped the local police. Two of his victims were the wife and son of a doctor working at Beelitz. He killed the 3-month-old baby boy by smashing his body into his tree stump. Then he gagged the mother with her bra, strangling her. After, he had sex with the body. Schmidt gained another nickname, Rosa Reus, German for pink giant. He was a very tall man and had a fetish for pink women's underwear, sometimes leaving a pair at his crime scene. He sexually assaulted almost all his victims. Finally, Schmidt was apprehended not by the incompetent police, but by a couple of joggers who found him masturbating in a forest, wearing women's clothing. If rejection by the country they once ruled wasn't enough to encourage the Soviets to abandon Beelitz-Heilstatten, maybe the threat of a local serial killer was. They finally abandoned the hospital in 1995, ending for good the hospital's century of intermittent military acquisition. After that, attempts to completely privatize the complex were unsuccessful, and today only small parts of the 60-building hospital complex is used, serving as a neurological rehab center and a center for Parkinson's care and research. All the rest, including the surgery, psychiatric ward, and rifle range, were abandoned completely in 2000. Since then, most of the abandoned complex has begun to decay, becoming an eerie testament to a hospital that saw so much difficult history. The derelict buildings are now covered in overgrowth, filled with rusty beds and vacant corridors smattered with graffiti. Some attempts have been made to restore the many buildings, but funds are seriously lacking. As such a central piece of German history, the hospital is bound to attract people interested in taking a peek into the past. It's just as likely to attract mischief makers and the homeless. What's more surprising is the role it played as the scene of a sex game turned horribly wrong. In 2008, a young model named Anya met with fetish photographer Michael K. at Beelitz-Heilstatten for some sadomasochistic role-playing. Michael then lured her to an abandoned apartment on the edge of the complex, beat her on the head with a frying pan, strangled her to death, and had sex with her body. Another horrific murder-rape reminiscent of the Beast of Beelitz. According to Anya's agent, the level of realism in this roleplay was not what her client had in mind. The apartment where she was brutally murdered was the former gatehouse of the complex and remains available for rent today. Today, the expansive grounds and numerous buildings at Beelitz-Heilstatten are surprisingly unsecured. Sure, things are locked up, but it's easy to find a way in to take eerie photos or get into some mischief. With the hospital's extensive and dark history, it has become a mecca for neo-Nazis and satanic worshippers, along with amateur ghost hunters, whose catalog of videos of ghostly encounters, too realistic to deny, grows year by year. Between Beelitz-Heilstatten's role caring for terminally ill TB patients, its use in 2 world wars, including the treatment of 2 brutal dictators, and involvement in the exploits of 2 demented modern murderers, spiritual unrest on the grounds is a given. Trespassers continue to loot, stirring up dust and old history which only further disrupts the paranormal entities that reside restlessly there. But as a Grade II historic building, Beelitz-Heilstatten isn't going anywhere other than slowly rotting away, a visual reminder of a dark and evil past. And so that is one of our stories. It's not a place that I've heard of before, although I'm sure that if you were to look online, quick little Google search, or type the name into YouTube, you could probably find a few things. Now let's move on to our second story, Wolfe Manor. Wolfe Manor was never your typical sanitarium and convalescent home. It was actually built as a large private home for Italian immigrant Tony Andreotti in Clovis, California in 1922. He ultimately couldn't afford the mansion and lost it. The building didn't become a home to treat the terminally ill until 1935, when it was renamed Clovis Avenue Sanitarium. The 8,000 square foot mansion could only hold 100 to 150 patients at a time, but lax regulations and even weaker enforcement allowed the owners to house many more than was safe. Clovis Avenue Sanitarium was always so crowded that patients were regularly forced to sleep in the halls. According to historians, there were often 20 patients assigned to one nurse. The sanitarium sank further and further into a state of chaos over the years. People would visit only to find disturbing scenes of patients lying naked in the hallways or finding them tied to their bed or a toilet. Staff were completely overwhelmed, and discussion of suicide and murder permeated the mansion and its patients. Possibly in an attempt to quell dangerous overcrowding and lack of staff control, a hospital wing for mental disorders was added on in 1954. That did little to stem the alarmingly high death rate at Clovis Avenue. As such a small facility, it's astounding that thousands died there during its operation. With no morgue and every available corner of the manor occupied by patient beds and supplies, the storing of deceased became a problem. It was commonly known by locals, and confirmed by historians, that dead bodies would pile up in the basement, sometimes stacked 8 high, before someone came to pick them up. As national health standards began to improve, it became clear that Clovis Avenue Sanitarium would never be a suitable facility. In 1992, it finally shut down, leaving behind a cringeworthy history of overcrowding and mistreatment. And so the Andreotti Mansion lay quiet until local entrepreneur Todd Wolfe bought the building in 1997 and renamed it Wolfe Manor. Wolfe saw the property for what it was, a spooky testament to a chilling history, so he turned it into a haunted attraction called Scream If You Can. Running a successful haunted attraction, Wolfe hired staff to dress in scary costumes and frighten visitors. What the workers never realized was how frightened they would become themselves. Things started happening, but I didn't want to tell anybody. One time, I felt a breath of air on my neck, and another I was touched on my lower back, said Wolfe. The owner was also bombarded by complaints of unexplainable occurrences from his staff. One claimed to have been pulled backwards into a room, only to find the room empty. No one was there. It became a common occurrence for workers to quit without notice, claiming that too many creepy things kept happening to them. The strangest story of an unexplainable occurrence came directly from the Clovis Police Department. They received and responded to numerous 911 calls and alarms from the mansion, only to find no one there and no apparent emergency. The strangest part is that as a haunted house attraction, the building had not been equipped with an alarm system or a telephone. Who in the world was calling? More importantly, how were the calls going through? Visitors to the Halloween attraction were obviously in the mood for some haunted thrills, but many got a lot more than they bargained for. Guests regularly reported feeling chills and being shoved by someone lurking unseen. The worst affected found themselves inexplicably sick to their stomachs and lightheaded. The manor also seemed to come with a cast of characters that Wolfe never hired to scare anyone, seen so often that they were given names by the guests. Mary, the figure of an elderly woman, can be found lurking the halls. Many others see Emily, a young girl who doesn't belong. A few others have seen a figure that is difficult to describe. They called him Man-Baby and left in a hurry. The unwanted disturbances of staff and guests became enough that Wolfe, an overall skeptic, enlisted the help of a psychic to inspect the home. Once they offered their opinion that the mansion was a hotbed of paranormal activity, ghost hunters came far and wide to see for themselves. What followed was hundreds of EVP recordings, photographs, and videos of unexplained figures and apparitions and disembodied voices that make your hair stand on end. Wolfe Manor continued as a successful haunted house for some time, where staged attractions and hired characters became secondary to the frightening occurrences the mansion produced itself. But Scream If You Can came to a halt in 2004 because of noise complaints. Wolfe kept the building, but it lay vacant and quiet, for the most part. Its popularity as one of the most haunted spots in the western U.S. attracted many vandals interested in the building's frightening history. Then in 2011, the city of Clovis decided the building was frightening in more than one way. Wolfe Manor's state of disrepair, including cracking, dry rot, and broken windows, had made it unsafe to occupy. It had also been labeled a hot spot. Police were constantly putting out unexplained fires on the property, reporting 96 police calls regarding the mansion since 2008. It was never explained why the fires kept occurring. The groundskeeper said that break-ins had reduced considerably over the years. Could it be the work of trapped spirits hoping for a way out of the hospital where so many people suffered and lost their lives? If that's the case, the city of Clovis heeded their message and demolished Wolfe Manor in November 2014. For those who believe, the hope is that with the teenage revelers gone and the building demolished, the overcrowded spirits of Clovis Avenue Sanitarium can finally rest, freed from the beds they were once chained to in the basement where their bodies laid forgotten. And that's the end of our second story. I think I've heard of Wolfe Manor before. I'm pretty sure that I've seen it on a few different ghost hunting shows. I'll have to look it up and see if I'm right, but it is another one that I will be doing some research on, a little bit of light reading when I have the time. But now we come to our final story. I'm hoping this one will be good. We'll see how it goes. Whittingham Mental Hospital. During the late 19th century, 3 mental asylums in Lancaster, England, were deemed completely full, prompting the region to build Whittingham Mental Hospital, which opened its doors in 1873. In a time when mass institutionalization was considered the best practice to handle the mentally ill, the hospital was viewed with pride in the area. A church, some farms, a railway, a telephone exchange, a post office, reservoirs, and a brewery all belonged to Whittingham. Don't forget the orchestra, brass band, ballroom, and butcher too. It opened with a capacity of 1,100 patients, but soon several annexes were added, including a sanatorium for people with infectious diseases. With a total capacity of 3,533 people, Whittingham became the largest mental hospital in Britain. Where did all these lunatics come from, you ask? The simple answer: most of the patients weren't certifiably crazy in the first place. It would seem that extreme poverty had a way of making people act out in ways that weren't considered normal. It was these pauper lunatics that Whittingham was specifically designed for. It became the asylum where the government sent patients that had no one to pay for their care. Historians have become skeptical about just how insane these pauper lunatics actually were. Most intake records were frustratingly vague, leaving no notes other than insane seamen or acute mania. The records go on to show that these patients lived the rest of their lives at Whittingham. Despite such a low rate of patient recovery at Whittingham, the hospital was considered a pioneer in electroencephalograms by experimenting with treatment on patients no less. The technology was supposedly an incredible therapy tool for many. For others, it was the opposite. 20th century England was a very volatile place, and Whittingham witnessed some of the worst of the history. During the First World War, many of the hospital's doctors were drafted, while the nurses volunteered. The largest mental hospital in Britain became desperately strapped for staff. Still, in 1918, the new West Annex of the hospital was repurposed to treat war casualties for one gruesome year. People who died there were buried in the private cemetery. 2 other wards were repurposed during World War II from 1939 to 1946 to treat military and civilian casualties alike. After the Great Wars were done, one would hope that the strain on patient care at Whittingham would subside. Unfortunately, the worst was yet to come. In the 1960s, some workers witnessed what they described as serious cruelty and ill treatment towards patients, as well as fraud in the hospital administration. In 1967, the Student Nurses Association filed a complaint, but they didn't get far. The head male nurse at Whittingham gathered the students, threatened them with libel and slander, and told them to put up or shut up. The students were silenced for a time, but once more people witnessed the mistreatment, the hospital management committee was forced to investigate. What they discovered about the treatment of patients at Whittingham was disturbing. In Ward 3, a male ward, patients were subject to a wet towel treatment. For patients who just couldn't behave themselves, nurses would take a wet towel or sheet and hang it around the patient's neck until they calmed down and fell unconscious. In Ward S2, 2 other nurses would put methylated spirits into the slippers and pockets of patients' bathrobes and set them on fire as some form of cruel punishment. The worst treatment of all was for the women of Ward 16. Here, patients were routinely locked outside in all sorts of weather or in washrooms and cupboards to discourage bad behavior. Patient ailments were left untreated, and at times they were only fed bread and jam served as slops. Some nurses enforced fluid restrictions during and after meals. Others tied unruly patients to their beds wearing only vests. One woman was dragged about by the hair. Disturbingly, this hellish ward was under the direction of the same Catholic sister for 47 years. It seemed that in Whittingham's long years in operation, the hospital had descended into anarchy. Wards were infested with cockroaches, ants, and even mice crawling over patients who were unable to leave their beds. Most of the hospital hovered at unstable living temperatures, 46 degrees Fahrenheit or less. The hospital staff developed a culture of petty theft between wards. In the upper ranks, serious fraud and embezzlement took money right out of patients' pockets. Money earmarked for patient care went instead to build expensive condos for hospital administrators. Once the atrocities at Whittingham came to light, the head nurse and head matron took early retirement. 2 other nurses were convicted of theft, while another nurse was imprisoned for manslaughter after an elderly patient he assaulted died. All we can say for sure about patient treatment at Whittingham is what student nurses and patients were able to prove in court. But everyone knew it was nothing close to the full extent of suffering at Whittingham in its many years of operation. After the inquiry, the hospital limped on under the watchful eyes of administrators, carrying a dark label and countless stories of cruelty. Despite efforts to redevelop the hospital into something new, creepy relics from its unsettling past lingered on to tell the tale the patients couldn't. Lawrence Butterfield was a worker at Whittingham in the mid-80s and recalls spooky occurrences at the hospital after its darkest years were over. Working the night shift, Butterfield had a prime opportunity to become jolted by things that go bump in the night. Not much seemed to faze him, though, until one night when he was visiting with another staff nurse after all the patients had gone to sleep. Suddenly, his colleague became very quiet, and her face contorted into a look of confusion and fear as she watched Butterfield. When he asked her what was wrong, she said that she had seen what she could only describe as a monkey shape hovering just above his shoulder. It had disappeared before Butterfield could notice, but both nurses were left unsettled. All the staff at Whittingham had an aversion to one corridor of the hospital in particular. According to Butterfield, it was notorious for weird occurrences. filled with windows that looked into older wards packed with old beds and furniture from Whittingham's dark past. Unexplained sounds and mysterious power shortages were only some of the strange experiences workers and patients had in this one hallway. But it served as a shortcut around the hospital, so they used it regularly. Once, Butterfield had the overwhelming feeling that someone was watching him in the corridor, frightening him enough to scurry his way to safety. Between a bad reputation, decreased patient load, and increasingly unsettling atmosphere at Whittingham, the hospital closed down in 1995. As you might expect, the abandoned hospital has developed a new reputation for unexplained phenomena. The empty halls seem to have minds of their own. Voices can be heard behind locked doors, and strange sightings have left many midnight thrill-seekers scrambling to leave the building. With its history of locking up the poor, experimental treatments, suffering the strains of 2 wars, and the rampant patient mistreatment that followed, the hospital seemed to dabble in all the worst parts of the history of mass institutionalization. It's no wonder the hospital's many wards send chills down any visitor's spine. Some might say that the tortured patients of Whittingham never received real justice for the behavior of the staff, and seek revenge on whoever might still linger in the buildings. But aside from the occasional trespasser, life and suffering at Whittingham are over, and the buildings continue to rot. And so that brings us to the end of our True Ghost Stories, Real Haunted Hospitals and Mental Asylum series. I don't know what the next stories will be. I'll have a look around. I'll see what might pique my interest. It could be anything from the Hunger Games series to maybe something a bit more classical. Jane Austen, possibly some Edith Wharton, or we might read a bit some more facts, or maybe we'll continue with ghost stories. But I can tell you that when we start leading up to Christmas, there will definitely be seasonal stories. There will be much holly jolly, and there will probably be a reading of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, possibly Polar Express. We'll see. But until then, I hope you have a wonderful day, whether it's morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. I hope it's great. And I will see you in the next video. Thanks for listening, and happy Halloween.